is Frank McNally from Public Spend Forum. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for I'm really excited about this particular webinar. It's another in our series on how to buy technology. And we got a great special guest today, Dave Zvenyach, who some of you probably know, and he's going to be introducing himself in a moment. But our topic today is how to buy and build technology using modern software delivery best practices. And so when I was coming up with this topic, it was actually inspired by some of the blogs I read of Dave's, and it's always been a topic of curiosity for me is how in the government, and specifically within the procurement space, can we more effectively buy or even build technology as we transition from sort of the waterfall days of the past to more modern software delivery practices. As always, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Evalua, for sponsoring today's event. Evalua is really incredible next generation procurement software. If you are unfamiliar with Evalua, I would invite you to check out some of the resources we have on Public Spend Forum, some of the demo days that Evalua has come in and given. Really terrific company, and we're thankful for their sponsorship. So I'm your host, Frank McNally. You're not going to hear much from me today. I'm really just going to be trying to tee up some questions and really hit Dave with some hard balls there, you know, as he presents. My passions, again, I'm passionate about improving public procurement. I've been in this space as an 1102 contracting officer. I've been on the other end as a contractor. I understand and appreciate the challenges that both sectors face. And so what I try to do is just bring a little bit of levity to the learning and content development that I do by breaking down complex topics into digestible tips in an engaging manner. And that's it. Public Spend Forum, on the other hand, we're a market research and best practices platform at publicspendforum.net. It's a great resource of information on supplier and market research data, best practices frameworks, the events like the one that we're presenting today, how to buy webinars, and then of course our community and network of peers and experts in public procurement. You can join the discussion at publicspendforum.net, create a free account, and get access to all of our terrific features. So I'm not really going to do much more by way of introduction because I want to save time for Dave so he can talk to us about how to buy and build technology using some of the expertise that he has. So Dave, thank you for joining us. And I'm going to watch and listen until my first question pops up. So thank you.
You know, normally in these presentations, there are these important pictures about, you know, building a swing, you know, tire swing, and there will probably be platitudes about how you need executive stakeholder buy-in and air cover and so on and so forth. And all of that's true, but those presentations don't really speak to the role of the acquisition professional in procuring vendors who are responsible for delivering the work. In this presentation, I wanted to cover something slightly different than you might normally see, which is how can an acquisition team procure and manage the best vendors to deliver software? And just to tee up the problem a little bit more, let me offer the first part of the solution, which is performance-based acquisition. If you don't know what that is, I'll describe that in a moment. You might be wondering, why does it help describe the problem? It's because most folks who work in services acquisition know that they're supposed to be using performance-based acquisition. So if the first part of the solution is to acquire better software deliveries using performance-based acquisition, what's the second part of the solution? And now, next slide. So really the core problem is this. We know that we're supposed to use performance-based acquisition, but how do we know what strong performance actually looks like for software delivery? And that's going to be the main question that we discuss in this webinar. So before we go too much further, I should probably introduce myself. So here goes. I'm Dave. I'm an independent consultant that helps organizations and government work smarter together. Practically, what that means is that I help companies get smart about strategic choices about whether and how to work with government. And I also help governments get smart about buying technology. I'm a massive procurement nerd, and I'm writing a book entitled Joyful Procurement, The Art of Digital Services. If you'd like to learn more, go to joyfulprocurements.com. I'm a former longtime public servant at the federal and state and local level. held a bunch of positions at the U.S. General Services Administration, including as an assistant commissioner for systems management at the Federal Acquisition Service. I was the executive director of 18F and the assistant commissioner for the Office of Acquisition for the Technology Transformation Service. Before GSA, I served as general counsel to the DC Council, as chief of staff to DC Council member Mary Che, and as a judicial law clerk for then Chief Judge Yvette Kane in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. In other words, I've been in a lot of different roles in a lot of different parts of a lot of different governments. I also have a law degree from George Washington University and a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Wisconsin. I'm currently broadcasting from Wisconsin, where it's quite cold right now. Go Packers. And with that out of the way, let's turn to the central issue, performance-based acquisition for software delivery. All right, so what is performance-based acquisition? Well, it's a preferred commercial technique. It focuses on contractors' deliverables rather than how contractors perform the work. Rather than using traditional statements of work that define requirements in great detail, performance-based acquisition uses performance work statements that define requirements more generally based on desired outcomes. So great, you buy outcomes, not detailed requirements. You buy the what, not the how. You get the idea. And the fun thing about treating performance-based acquisition as a hot topic is that it's actually a really, really old topic. It has been a thing for almost 30 years. This stuff has guidance dating way back to 1991 from the Office of Management and Budget on how to best conduct performance-based service contracting. So this is not new. That said, even though it's been around for more than a generation, performance-based acquisition still confounds acquisition professionals in the procurement of technology services. Indeed, just this September, the U.S. Government Accountability Office wrote that, quote, some cultural resistance to PBA has endured, and that, quote, some acquisition officials are still reluctant to give contractors control over how agencies' requirements will be met under PBA because they fear they may not get what they need. Let's just reflect a little bit on that last phrase, because they fear that they may not get what they need. In my view, this is actually a reasonable fear. There's so many vendors out there who promise that they can deliver X, Y, or Z, but when push comes to shove and the system gets turned on, it's the agency holding the bag and the vendor actually can't deliver it. So how can we really know that we can get what we need? Unfortunately, folks will tell you that the only really good indicator of future performance is past performance. But we know that past performance data can be unreliable, and relying on past performance as evaluation criteria carries some protest risk. And therefore, it's not always a great indicator. So if PBA is used, but it's not used as much as it should, and even when it is done, it's not really done all that well, how can we improve upon it? Well, fortunately, the General Services Administration published a thing called the Steps to Performance-Based Acquisition, which is actually a really helpful guide to using PBA. I strongly encourage you to just read the document, but I will summarize a few things here and identify a few key highlights for you to use in your practice. And here we go. So the Steps to Performance-Based Acquisitions defined 8 steps for any performance-based acquisition. Hilariously, there used to be a document that had 7 steps. And if we still had 7 steps, I'd be stuck permanently thinking of this guy. 7 steps indeed. You can't even get your heart going. Fortunately, GSA added an 8th step at the end, and so now I can focus on the job at hand. I know that joke wasn't very good. It's a stretch.
We just don't have a laugh track on this, unfortunately, because I definitely would have hit it then, Dave.
Yep, there would have been a rim shot there. It would have been great. But let's move forward and talk about the 8 steps to performance-based acquisition. So the first steps are: 1, establish an integrated project team. 2, describe the problem that needs solving, aka market research. 3, sorry about that. 3 is market research. My bad. 4 is develop a performance work statement or statement of objectives. 5, decide how to measure and manage performance. 6, select the right contractor. 7, manage performance. And that magical 8th step, contract closeout. Now we'll come back to all of these steps, or come back to some of them, particularly steps 3 through 7 later in the presentation. Okay, So for now, it's simply worth observing that the goal of all of these 8 steps is to answer 4 central questions. And here's a quote: a successful acquisition answers 4 questions. What do I need? When do I need it? Who needs to get it to me? And how do I know it's good when I get it? And as we'll see, answering these questions are deceptively hard for software delivery. And as GAO noted in that report we saw before, services differ from products in several aspects and can offer challenges when attempting to define requirements and establish measurable performance-based outcomes. So there's another problem. How can you measure performance for software delivery? How do you know it's good when you get it? For a long time, answering this question involved some hand waving and eventually an admission that no one really had any good answers other than you know it when you see it. And while that may work for Justice Potter Stewart's definition of obscenity, it's not likely going to pass muster with a protest. And so it used to be that the only surefire way to hire good teams seemed to be to have expertise in-house and let the experts select other experts. Incidentally, before I get too far down the other road, it's worth observing that this is probably still the best way to hire good teams, to have good teams internally. But if you don't have that, you're not totally out of luck, because in the last year, we now have a new framework for measuring software delivery performance that provides some deep insight into how government, and frankly, other organizations, can effectively select and manage modern software delivery teams. And that framework comes from the book Accelerate by Dr. Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humboldt, and Gene Kim. So let's talk about that. Accelerate is the product of 4 years of research, beginning in 2013 and covering over 23,000 survey responses from 2,000 organizations, ranging from 5 employees to 10,000 employees, from greenfields to legacy development. In the conclusion of the research, they wrote the following, quote, "Over our 4-year research program, we have been able to identify the capabilities that drive performance in software delivery and impact organizational performance, and we have found that they work for all types of organizations." When I read that sentence the first time, and even now when I reread it, that sentence sends chills down my spine. Seriously? All organizations? To me, like, this is the digital services version of like Newton's law of universal gravity. It's an extraordinary proposition that a bounded set of capabilities can meaningfully describe and predict software delivery performance, but that's what the research shows, and now we're all better off for it. So on its face, this research is valuable for a few reasons. Most obviously, to do it, the authors had to first define and measure performance. Holy cow, this is the answer to our performance-based acquisition conundrum. So let's start there. But realize this, it's not even the most groundbreaking part of the research. Okay, so before we talk about what good software delivery performance looks like, we can explain what are not good metrics for software delivery performance. Things like lines of code, story points, utilization, and system uptime. These are outputs. They're not the same as outcomes, and the authors are trying to measure outcomes. So right off the gates, let's not use those metrics. They're not great. But so what are better metrics? Well, the authors identified 4 core metrics of software delivery, and we'll cover each of these in detail. First is lead time, second is deployment frequency, third is mean time to restore, and the fourth is change fail percentage. Now, notably, these 4 metrics fall into 2 general focuses. 1 is tempo of delivery, and 2 is the reliability and quality of the software delivered. I'm going to dwell on this slide for a while because it's important to go through each of the metrics and make sure that everyone's on the same page. So first up is lead time. In theory, lead time is the amount of time between a customer need to customer satisfaction. And while this is the ideal metric, the authors actually chose to measure a subset of it, the time between code commit and code running in production. For those who don't know what a code commit is, that's a process that a software developer uses to add or remove code from a program. Think of it as a submit button for code, and even though that's a bad analogy, the point is that the authors were trying to get at a measure of time from when the developer says, "I'm done here," to the time that the code is actually used in production. This focus had the advantage of being easier to measure while still being a core part of the metric. The second metric that they used is deployment frequency. Now here, the authors were getting after a concept of batch size, which is an overall core part of lean practices. So what's batch size? Batch size refers to the size of the overall size of code or features that are being shipped. Doing things in smaller chunks is a good thing for reducing complexity, and it's a really useful metric, but it's also hard to get at directly, so the authors used a proxy metric. And to proxy batch size, the authors focused on how often code is released into production, everything from a few minutes to every 6 months. The third is mean time to restore. Although there are many metrics of system reliability, and particularly notable is system uptime, the authors decided to focus on the holistic view of the inevitable scenario of failure. A system will fail, and when it does, the question is how long it will take, on average, to repair and deploy the fix. Fourth and finally is change fail percentage. This is a metric of intrinsic software quality. How often do you have to go back and fix things? In production, this is similar to a defect rate, but it's not actually the same thing as a defect rate, because instead of focusing on how many defects you have, it's focusing on how often your changes result in degraded service or subsequently require new remediation. So in sum, you've got 4 metrics, 2 of which define tempo, lead time and deployment frequency, and then 2 metrics that define quality and failure, the team's ability to fix failures and the team's ability to avoid failures in the first place. These are the 4 metrics that define software delivery performance. By itself, those 4 indicators of software delivery performance would be a major contribution for an acquisition professional attempting to use performance-based acquisition. But wait, there's more. As I mentioned, these metrics aren't just defining what performance looks like. The book also identifies what capabilities are correlated and predictive of performance. Right? It's amazing. So let's talk about that. What capabilities are there, and how many are there? Well, it turns out there are 24 key capabilities, and those capabilities can be grouped into 5 large buckets, or 5 categories: continuous delivery, architecture, product and process, lean management and monitoring, and culture. Although it would take a long time to go through the capabilities one by one, I will dwell on the categories. So let's start with the first category, continuous delivery. The book describes continuous delivery as, quote, a set of capabilities that enables us to get changes of all kinds, features, configuration changes, bug fixes, experiments, into production or into the hands of users safely, quickly, and sustainably. To do this, the authors identify 3 major foundations for continuous delivery: comprehensive configuration management, continuous integration, and continuous testing. Essentially, the idea here is that developers need a way to be able to rapidly and meaningfully change the software they're working on. And to do that, you have to have good practices, good testing practices, deployment automation, strong branching, and version control. Okay, so then we have the next capability category, which is around architecture. So the authors identified architecture as a second category of capability, but instead of focusing on what specific architectural practices you would use, the authors actually focused on characteristics of good architecture and not implementation details. Specifically, the authors honed in on testability, which derives from the statement, quote, we can do most of our testing without requiring an integrated environment. And the other characteristic was deployability, which is that we can and do deploy or release our application independently of other applications and services it depends on. These statements speak to how not only individual components of code are written, but also how they integrate with each other. If you have components that are hard to test or components that require a lot of dependencies, it's going to be hard to frequently deploy and manage failure. The third capability category is product and process. Now here, the authors focus on what comes from lean product development and lean startup movement to, quote, emphasize testing your product's design and business model by performing user research frequently from the very beginning of the product lifecycle. There are several components to that: working in small batches, making flow of work visible, gathering and implementing customer feedback, and team experimentation. Although this third category, and it's number 3 in order, My own experience suggests that it may be extraordinarily important, and perhaps the most important for good software delivery. The authors focus on ensuring that you're building products that customers actually value and actually use, and on ways of finding ways to deliver that value quickly. The capabilities to quickly discover, prototype, and validate product needs are part of a superpower to help avoid waste in delivery and ensure that you aren't deploying useless features that eventually you'll want to swap out with useful features. That is, if the product even survives. The fourth category is lean management and monitoring. Now here, they're really focusing in on how the delivery team keeps things in flow. And they argue that visibility and high quality communication enables are the key to flow. This fourth category includes concepts of limiting works in progress, visualizing work, getting feedback from production, using lightweight change approvals, and proactive notifications from the system in production. These are practices that are related to well-run agile processes and speak often to the trade-offs that an organization makes to keep things shipping without getting bogged down over time. And the final and last capability category is probably the hardest to find, which is a commitment to a healthy organizational culture. The authors found that a generative culture, what they call a Westrom culture, after a sociologist named Ron Westrom, is predictive of high performance. What's a generative or Westrom culture? It's one where organizations focus on the mission, where they ask how do we accomplish our goal, and everything is subordinated to good performance. So what are we doing to do what we are supposed to do? Now, a generative or Western culture is contrasted with a pathological or bureaucratic organization, but happily, no one has ever seen that in government, have we? Having high trust, and there was another rim shot right there, thank you. Having high trust, yep, applause, applause. Having high trust and cooperation and collaboration across teams is often treated as nice to have in organizations, including in government. And the authors find that for high performance, it's actually a must-have. So now we've outlined the 8 steps to performance-based acquisition, and we've covered how acquisition both defines software delivery performance and helps us identify what capabilities are correlated with strong performance. We can bring it all together and answer, how can we buy modern software delivery? So here are 4 ways. Let's start with market research. So during the pre-solicitation phase, good market research is critical to successful procurement. Step 3 of these steps to procurement-based acquisition, or performance-based acquisition, excuse me, says that an acquisition team needs to be knowledgeable about commercial offerings, capabilities, and practices. To do this, acquisition teams will often rely on techniques such as request for information, industry days, sources sought, notices, and pre-solicitation conferences. But step 3 also explains that one-on-one meetings with industry are a particularly effective approach to market research. As the SPBA states, while many may not realize it, one-on-one meetings with industry leaders are not only permissible, they are more effective than pre-solicitation or pre-proposal conferences. Now, why is a one-on-one meeting helpful? From my experience, it's extremely revealing to just ask people about how they work and to see how they answer their questions. From asking probing questions, and now armed with the Accelerate framework, you can start to assess your likely vendor's capabilities and remember their potential future performance. So what might that look like? Well, suppose you ask, how often do you deploy features into production? How often do they fail? How do you know? What have you done to improve it? What prevents you from doing more? Asking these questions helps address a whole bunch of things. It speaks to whether they're tracking performance metrics like deployment frequency and change fail percentage. It speaks to whether they have continuous delivery capabilities. It speaks to whether they have lead monitoring capabilities. It speaks to their organization's cultural capability to inquire and improve. So in a one-on-one inquiry, you can really help sort out how strong the industry partners are, and it also can inform your own agency's gaps. So what do I mean by that? Well, it can reveal where you may want to spend energy to shore up your own weaknesses and play to your strengths. For example, many delivery teams that traditionally work with government are hindered by inadequate tooling for continuous delivery and heavy change control processes. Lord knows we did. But by spending time before the acquisition as an integrated acquisition team, meeting with industry and learning about what works and what doesn't, can really help bring about the necessary internal change to invest in better approaches to tooling and delivery patterns. Hopefully, market research can drive the government to improve its own chance of receiving quality software even before the contract is awarded. So what else? Well, as we know in steps 4 and 5 of the steps to performance-based acquisition, they describe the importance of having objective metrics that the government and the vendor can use to assess quality performance. So step 4 reminds us that in developing a performance work statement, you need to have measurable performance standards and acceptable quality levels. So what might those performance standards look like? Thinking face? Well, as I touched on earlier, there are 4 metrics that Accelerate uses to define software delivery performance: lead time, deployment frequency, mean time to restore, and change fail percentage. And even though I would expect the government and vendors to have discussions both before and after the award about what constitutes acceptable levels for each of those metrics, any performance work statement or quality assurance surveillance plan should at least consider how the teams monitor and improve on these metrics. And this particular chart comes directly out of the book as various levels that are seen out in the wild, so to speak. And if this all feels like the holy grail to you, it's probably because you've now been paying attention. This is incredible stuff. But there's more. Now we have step 6, which is source selection, and you might be able to anticipate where I'm going. Here, the steps to performance-based acquisition really shine in terms of using good methods to help identify qualified teams. So for one example, they suggest to structure the acquisition so that the government describes the problem that needs to be solved and that vendors compete by proposing solutions. Then once they've submitted proposed solutions, the quality of the solution and the performance measures become discriminators in best value evaluation. This is extremely valuable advice. Imagine asking vendors about how they might balance security and change control processes and high deployment frequency. That's a governmental problem. The government is notably security and procedurally driven. So if we let vendors propose solutions to that problem and figure out which companies are really prepared to deal with the government's needs, that might actually be a useful discriminator. Or here's another suggestion by the SPBA. Use oral presentations and other opportunities to communicate. As we discussed before, asking targeted questions can be very powerful stuff. Thinking about ways to suss out organizations' capabilities through dialogue has been one of the most successful things I had seen work at 18F and TTS Office of Acquisition. Using Accelerate's capabilities framework can even further help organize the conversation around performance. And finally, when addressing past performance, which again is super important for performance-based acquisition, you can actually now focus on valuable past performance data. So instead of relying on certifications or maturity models or ISO quality standards or CPARS data, just simply knowing that lean product development capabilities can predict Western organizational culture, software delivery performance, organizational performance, and less burnout, it's a super reasonable thing to include a vendor's product management approach as part of the technical evaluation criteria. And that's extremely powerful as well. So the last way that we might be able to combine SPBA, and certainly there may be others, but here's my fourth, is we get to step 7, which is around performance management. Now, here the SPBA describes how it's important to keep the team together throughout the performance of the contract, and there's a suggestion that measuring and managing a project, the attainment of performance goals and objectives requires the continued involvement of the acquisition team, especially the program manager. It also requires considerable involvement by the acquisition's new members, contractor personnel. And here's where I think Accelerate becomes a final bit of a game changer. The metrics that Accelerate describes, lead time, deploy frequency, mean time to restore, and change fail percentage, don't actually require significant technical knowledge to be successful. It only really requires that the government own responsibility for defining its needs and allowing the vendor to manage its processes to define the how. But it does provide a shared understanding of what success and performance looks like. If you're not meeting customers' needs quickly, if you're not deploying frequently, if you're not fixing bugs and avoiding introducing new bugs, well, then you have a problem. And if you're doing those things, the government doesn't really need to sweat the small stuff. So it's actually easier to bring the whole acquisition team into the conversation around performance and it's no longer the exclusive domain of one part of the organization. Suddenly, performance becomes a shared responsibility. In other words, using DevOps and lean product metrics to assess how things are going can really make sure that teams are continuously improving and consistently shipping quality software, and everyone can have shared visibility. It's really magical stuff when you think about it. Okay, so to sum up and to assign some homework, if you're in the business of buying software delivery, at the end of this webinar, go ahead and visit the Steps to Performance-Based Acquisitions website and just read it. It's a really valuable resource in and of itself. And then once you're done, I strongly encourage getting the team together to think about how you might measure software delivery performance. Accelerate offers its framework, and it's incredible. Measuring tempo and quality as the indicators of performance feels like the right approach to me. And fortunately, the authors aren't just making it up. They've conducted peer-reviewed research to validate it. But once you've decided for yourself how you can measure performance, you can look to the organization's capabilities to assess whether they may have the ability to meet your needs. And further, once you've actually started working with the contractor, whether you're continuously improving to strengthen and extend those capabilities. So I hope you have found all of this useful. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to email me at dave@zvenyach.com. I'd also be remiss if I didn't replug my book called Joyful Procurement, The Art of Digital Services Acquisition, which I am working on right now. And so if you are interested in updates in that book or other content from me, visit joyfulprocurement.com and sign up for updates. In the meantime, I really appreciate you joining me for the webinar, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Dave. That's incredible. I mean, I think one of the, maybe if we can leave the slides up. Yeah, so, you know, you mentioned at the end they're sweating the small stuff. I mean, that struck me as a pretty important thing because, you know, early in the presentation, as you're setting up the Accelerate framework, one of your points was we don't really want to measure outputs because that can create effectively a perverse incentive. If you're measuring output, like number of releases or whatever, then you're basically queuing and you're cluing the development team to focus on releases. If you're measuring outcomes, you're actually looking for working software. And that allows your acquisition team and your valuation team to stop worrying about the details, because the details of a software development process aren't really necessary to understand, especially for us on the buy side. What we care about is the output, working software delivered to users. And I think for a long time, the focus had been on, and probably because of the disparity between Western cultures and the cultures that many people in our audience, especially within their government, probably operate in, is a focus on detail because that's what you can control. So there is a degree of dissonance that I think is required when you're buying software development to get out of the weeds of the small stuff and just focus on how do I know that my team's set up to deliver working software when they say they're going to deliver it. And I think that's what strikes me about the Accelerate framework and how it can be so useful to digital services teams.
Yeah, and just to extend that a little bit further, I mean, one of the things that the authors touch on early in the book is the difference between continuous improvement and maturity models. So the authors don't focus on a maturity model, they focus on these capabilities. And that really, I think, frames the question properly, is rather than thinking, okay, are you hitting your deployment numbers and your frequency numbers or your mean time to restore numbers? You're asking, are we moving in the right direction? And those types of conversations, I think, are much healthier dialogue between industry and government, allow for you to not focus on, well, why are your mean time to restore numbers not working? And really focusing on, well, what can we do as a integrated project team to get things moving in the right direction. So focusing on continuous improvement and capabilities rather than sort of a static maturity model, I think is a really healthy way to sort of get out of that rut.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of want to get out of the way. I mean, if you hire the right team, which is a challenge unto itself, but let's say you are able to hire the right team and you feel good about them, your job from a management perspective on the government side really should be to let the process work. I think it's good that we have these types of frameworks because, I mean, frankly, historically speaking, software development, modern software development, is really not that old. We have methods for measuring manufacturing processes because we've been manufacturing things for a century, a decade, right? Decades, centuries, etc. But with software development and delivery, that's something that's relatively new, and it's changing quite frequently. And so it really is necessary to have an entirely new mindset when you go in to either buy or build software and ultimately know what success is going to look like. I'm going to encourage anyone out there with questions to submit them through the chat or through our Q&A. I'm going to keep an eye on that. I didn't know if you had sort of a comment on that, you know, in your experience on the government side, like, are people's mindsets changing? Are they understanding, yeah, this is relatively new. We have to have some trust to let it work, vice a real strict control or manufacturing mindset when we're building software? I mean, do you think the culture's starting to receive that?
I think GAO actually still, I think they're pretty much spot on in terms of the diagnosis, which is that folks know that they're supposed to be doing this. There is a general trend in the right direction, but there's both a cultural resistance to it, and then a valid challenge associated with using the right metrics and the right approach. I recall, like I said, you know, until Accelerate, there wasn't really an easy way to define what software delivery performance would look like that was more than just, well, it worked for us in this particular office at this particular time. There really wasn't a good vocabulary. There weren't agreed to metrics. There wasn't sort of a good way of knowing that, you know, what good software delivery looks like. And, you know, I really do wish that I had the Accelerate framework several years ago, because I think it would have been a really useful tool to start having those productive conversations. In that regard, as you sort of noted, we're still in relatively early days. A lot of the thinking around digital service acquisition in particular is still pretty novel. And so I think there's a lot of space to be creative and to test out some of these practices and see which ones really stick.
So we have a question from Michelle. She's curious if you've seen any case studies where maybe this approach didn't have results or didn't create the positive results that you would expect.
So I haven't. I think what I can say is that I've seen varying levels of success. And what I mean by that is I'm thinking of one particular program that I worked with where it was clear that we weren't really, we weren't doing it right, so to speak. But we did start to find that when we focused on improving our deployment frequency, when we cut down from every 3 months to every 6 weeks, and then ultimately to every 2 weeks, that we started to see better performance across the board and better communication. To do that meant that we had to, bring in conversations with security earlier and do what the authors describe as shifting left in security. And it required some other sort of changes in terms of our architecture and our practices, using things like smoke testing and the like to really get there. And so I think using these metrics as a good sort of rallying point has been successful in my own experience. I'm not familiar with any where you go, nope, that was an out and out failure, but your mileage may vary depending on your organization's where you're at in your journey.
You mentioned some of those changes that you made in your experience, and I'm just curious if those changes are made to enable flow, which is a characteristic you brought up, and I think it's pretty important. Can you talk a little bit more about flow and why that's so important for digital services teams and digital delivery teams?
Sure. So there are a couple of things that happen. All of these things really are ways of trying to improve communication. So software delivery is fundamentally a human enterprise. It requires people making choices about how to design and develop the software. And when people are making judgments, they are using whatever information they have at their disposal. And if they have the best information, they'll make better decisions. And so a lot of it is really just trying to make sure that you have good communication patterns. You have really good sense of what you're supposed to be doing and when and where. And having good flow ensures that you're not sort of getting spiky. It lets you focus on putting as much throughput as you can without getting sort of turbulent. So like I mentioned before, I have a mechanical engineering background, and you really want, you don't want turbulence. You want laminar flow so that you can move things through the process. But to do that requires a lot of energy, frankly. You've got to make sure that you have the right visualization methods. You have the right executive leadership expectations, the commitments to work in progress limits. That's actually one that I've found government really struggles with. We're really bad at saying no to things, despite what you might think. So putting those practices into place are all really intended to improve communication, really allow you to focus, really allow you to execute, and then move on to the next challenge.
I mean, flow sort of, it feeds the learning engine too, right? I mean, there's a lot of the work involves trial and error and testing new things. And if you have flow, you sort of enable that to occur more organically and more efficiently.
Absolutely.
So we have a question from Dom. If you have any tips on how to communicate with an IT vendor whose performance is a little bit below expectations, even though you've got maybe some desire by the agency to keep that vendor around.
Yep.
What's sort of a good way to communicate?
It's a great question, and this is where I think that the capabilities and the metrics that Accelerate offers are a really good anchor. So I might look at those 24 capabilities and say, where are we missing capabilities? Where aren't we strong? Is it that we're not implementing work in progress limits? Is it that we're not using version control? Is it that we're not using automated testing? What are we actually missing in terms of capabilities? And then understand, well, why are we missing those capabilities? Mm-hmm. And that's a conversation to have with the vendor. But then also to say, we're going to start baselining now with respect to things like change failure percentage. So if you're introducing new features and they're failing most of the time, and that means that now we're able to deliver fewer features in future sprints, then we need to have a conversation about software quality. Are you actually writing the code in a way that is that's maintainable, or are you creating basically future technical debt? And having those conversations with the team can help reveal whether they're actually quote unquote capable to do the job, or whether they're not ready for it yet. My sense is that most of the vendors have the capability, otherwise they wouldn't have gotten the gig in the first place. But there may be some areas where they need to really strengthen and shore up their work, and also where there may need to be other changes in practice. And so going back to the example that I was thinking of before, we really had struggled with deployment frequency, and part of it is that there was a major disconnect between security and the delivery teams. Mm-hmm. There was a delivery team, multiple delivery teams. There was a sort of a centralized SRE team and a separate security office, and none of those three different groups really communicated well with each other. But as we started to move to shift left, which is one of the capabilities, as we started to shift left on security and bring security into the conversation earlier, it allowed us to have more frequent deployments, and that allowed us to have better flow and all of the virtuous things that we described earlier.
I mean, yeah, having the conversation with the vendor is probably the only way that you're going to uncover friction that you might not have known existed. I mean, I've heard stories of, teams that are behind schedule or aren't getting things done, and nobody can really figure out why until the contracting professional has that conversation with the vendor and says, look, what's going on? They identify the issue, and it's some report that the contractor is spending, hours on that's not even really getting read. It just happens to be in there, and it's superfluous. It's not necessary. And the minute you cut that out, you turn the flow back on. So there's just nothing that can really take the place of that communication and asking those questions. You're never going to find out where the problems are through email. Sometimes it just takes candid conversations, and the procurement professional, frankly, is in kind of a unique position there, because we do have to manage that we have to support our program. We have to make sure that the program gets what they need, but then we also have an obligation to ensure that the contractor is in the best position to succeed. So that's a great question, Dom, and a good answer, Dave. Joey's curious about your thoughts on whether the government procurement side, our profession, struggles with seeing the bigger picture behind limiting work in progress, yet delivering faster because of it.
Yeah, and there's this is actually one of the more counterintuitive parts of agile and lean practices, and I've seen this actually done in live sort of demonstrations. There's a whole body of math that's called queuing theory that supports the idea that your cycle time is related to your batch size. So remember we talked about batch size before. As you have larger batches, you have longer cycle times. You have smaller batches, you have quicker cycle times. But it's not intuitive. It's not an intuitively obvious thing to an individual. And more to the point, what's really fascinating about work in progress limits and cycle times is that you actually may experience a situation where individuals have longer cycle times, but the organization has shorter cycle times. And so if you're measuring at the individual level from a performance perspective, it actually is counterproductive, because individuals may try to hoard their particular batch and then try to get it all done and then move it to the next person, rather than focusing on flow. And so work in progress limits are a really counterintuitive management tool. And as a result, they don't often get adopted. But when someone actually gets it, sort of the light bulb goes off in their head and they go, aha, work in progress limits are actually the way for me to get faster delivery. That's when really wonderful things happen. I would guess that a lot of you in the contracting community are able to process contracts much better if you're only working on 1 or 2 contracts at a time, as opposed to dealing with hundreds of contracts at a time. And that's no different from general work in progress limits in other places. Managing the flow so that you only have 1 or 2 at a time is a management exercise, and one that requires better communications, but that's the whole point, is to figure out how organizationally you can have better communication and delivery.
It just gets back to the sort of the measuring outputs versus outcomes. I mean, outputs are inherently manipulatable, I think. But I'm also curious about sort of the queuing theory, and this is just, I don't know if this is a totally off the wall question, but I mean, I wonder how much of it is psychological. If I remember being a contracting professional with loads of actions, and there can be something stifling about feeling like you just have so much. Even if I know I have expectations of getting things done, but I'm being tasked in smaller batches, maybe I feel freer and I feel like more capable of working. I don't know if I'm taking that too deep or not, but
I think there's definitely a relationship. I mean, most folks will tell you that, to get things done faster, you've got to focus on one thing and get it done and then move on to the next thing. That's both driven by math and also by psychology. They're independently contributing factors.
So Accelerate's the book, and Dave, you've written a bunch on this topic. I think I would say this for our acquisition community out there. If this is all sounding very new to you, and some of these terms don't make sense, the only way that you're going to learn, I think, is to just immerse yourself in it. There is a degree of osmosis, I think, that occurs when you're learning a new field like digital services delivery. I remember when I was getting into this, I just read everything I could, and even if I didn't fully understand it, I found that 6 months in, 8 months in, things started to connect with me a little bit. So read Dave's blog, read Accelerate, read the Agile Manifesto. You're going to start understanding it, and this stuff is going to start to become very intuitive. Obviously, when you're building frameworks and you're building a science behind something, you're logically going to make it a little bit more academic. But in reality, Agile development and delivering working software has this wonderful, simple elegance to it. And thanks to folks like Dave and the authors of Accelerate, we're able to now put it into practice in a pretty process-oriented government workplace. So, any parting thoughts, Dave, before we sign off?
No, just thank you again for the opportunity to present. For those of you who are interested in this, like I said, do feel free to reach out. And looking forward to seeing you all be successful and executing performance-based acquisition for software delivery and getting great results.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We will have a recording of this presentation on Public Spend Forum. We'll be emailing all of you the materials that we discussed today, along with a couple of extra resources that we think might be helpful. So stay tuned to your email. Stay tuned to Public Spend Forum for more events on this topic. And thank you all for your attendance today and your attention. And thanks to you, Dave, for your time.